I didn't ruin my life in one dramatic moment. I didn't wake up one day and choose destruction. What I did was far more dangerous. I stayed quiet. I waited. I postponed. And one day, I realized my life had already happened without me. If you had asked anyone who knew me back then, they would have said I was doing fine. I had a job. I had a routine. I had people who knew my name and nodded when they saw me. From the outside, nothing looked broken. But inside, something had been slowly shutting down, like a house where the lights go out one room at a time and no one notices because the hallway still glows. I remember the first moment I felt it. Not sharply. Not painfully. Just a quiet awareness, like realizing you've been holding your breath for too long but forgetting why. I was sitting alone in my car, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I had nowhere urgent to be, and nowhere I truly wanted to go. That scared me more than panic ever could. I told myself it was just exhaustion. Everyone feels lost sometimes, right? Everyone doubts. Everyone delays the hard decisions. So I did what I always did, I moved on without moving forward. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. I learned how to function without feeling present. I answered questions automatically. I smiled at the right moments. I said I'm fine so often that it stopped sounding like a lie. It became a script. And scripts are comforting. They require no courage. The worst part wasn't sadness. It was numbness. Sadness still means you care. Numbness is what happens when you've cared for too long without changing anything. There were moments when life tried to interrupt me. Opportunities disguised as discomfort. Invitations that scared me. Conversations that demanded honesty. I declined all of them politely, reasonably, responsibly. I told myself I would come back to them later, when I was more prepared, more confident, more certain. I didn't realize that later was just another word for never. I avoided conflict like it was poison. I avoided decisions like they were traps. I avoided myself most of all. People around me grew. They changed jobs, moved cities, fell in love, made mistakes, recovered, tried again. I watched them from the safe distance of my routine. I congratulated them. I listened to their stories. And each time, something inside me tightened, not jealousy exactly, but a quiet grief for a version of myself that never showed up. At night, when the noise of the day finally faded, the thoughts came. Not dramatic thoughts. Not suicidal thoughts. Just questions with no answers. Is this it? Is this really all I am going to be? When did I stop choosing? I never answered those questions. I learned to drown them out. Screens helped. Work helped. Fatigue helped. If I was tired enough, I didn't have to think. And I became very good at staying tired. There was one night I remember clearly. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of traffic. I suddenly had the overwhelming sense that I was already late for something important, not an event, not an appointment, but my own life. My chest tightened. My throat burned. For a brief moment, I thought I might finally break. But I didn't. I turned on my side. And I slept. That was the pattern. Almost feeling something. Almost changing. Almost waking up. And then choosing comfort instead of truth. Years passed like this. Quietly. Efficiently. Safely. Until the day I realized I couldn't remember the last decision I had made that was truly mine. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came in silence. I was standing in line at a grocery store, watching the conveyor belt move items forward, one by one. And suddenly it hit me, my life felt exactly like that belt. Things moving forward, time passing, but nothing actually changing direction. I felt invisible. Not to others, to myself. That night, I sat alone and tried to trace my life backward. I tried to find the moment where things went wrong. There wasn't one. Just 1,000 small silences. 1,000 moments where I chose not to speak, not to act, not to risk. I had mistaken stability for safety. I had mistaken patience for wisdom. I had mistaken fear for responsibility. And in doing so, I let my life happen without me. I wish I could say I changed immediately. That I stood up, packed my bags, and reinvented myself overnight. But real breakdowns are rarely cinematic. They are slow. They creep in quietly and sit beside you, waiting. What finally broke me wasn't pain. It was clarity. And clarity is terrifying. Because once you see the truth, you can no longer hide behind confusion. That was the beginning of the end of the life I had been surviving. And the beginning of something far more dangerous. The moment I realized I could disappear, not die, not vanish dramatically, but simply step out of the life everyone expected me to keep living. And that thought scared me, because for the first time in years, it also felt like relief. The idea didn't arrive fully formed. It started as a whisper, something I barely allowed myself to hear. What if I didn't fix my life? What if I didn't explain myself? What if I didn't fight for the version of me everyone already knew? What if I simply left? Not ran away in panic. Not disappeared in shame. Just stepped out quietly, the same way I had been living, but this time, on purpose. That thought terrified me because it felt honest. I began to notice how much of my life was built on expectations that no one actively enforced anymore. I was carrying rules that had expired years ago. Obligations that existed only because I kept honoring them. Roles I had never consciously accepted, yet performed every day without question. I started asking myself dangerous questions. Who would I be if no one expected anything from me? What parts of my life were real, and what parts were just inertia? If I vanished tomorrow, who would actually miss me? Not the version of me they were used to. The answers weren't comforting. I realized I had become easy to replace. Not because I was worthless, but because I had made myself small. Predictable. Convenient. I had trained the world to function without my presence being essential. That realization hurt more than rejection ever could. So I began preparing, not physically at first, but mentally. I imagined conversations that would never happen. Explanations I would never give. I practiced letting go of the need to be understood. That was the hardest part. I had always believed that if people just knew how I felt, everything would make sense. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Most people don't need to understand you in order to move on. And neither did I. The more I allowed myself to imagine leaving, the lighter I felt. That scared me too. Relief felt like betrayal. As if I was abandoning something sacred. But what I was really abandoning was a lie, the lie that endurance alone gives life meaning. I didn't tell anyone what I was thinking. I smiled. I showed up. I fulfilled obligations. But inside, I was slowly detaching. Every goodbye became quieter. Every interaction felt slightly less permanent. There was a moment, a specific one, when I knew I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I was sitting with someone who cared about me, listening to them talk about future plans that included me. I nodded at the right times. I said the right words. And all I felt was distance. Not anger. Not resentment. Just the calm certainty that I wouldn't be there. That's when guilt arrived. Not the loud kind. The heavy kind. The kind that presses down on your chest and asks, who do you think you are to leave? The kind that reminds you of kindness received, of patience shown, of moments where people tried even if they didn't know how. For a while, guilt almost stopped me. I told myself that leaving would make me selfish. That staying was the more mature choice. That sacrificing myself quietly was noble. But then I asked a question that changed everything. If someone else were living my life trapped, muted, slowly disappearing. Would I tell them to stay? The answer was immediate. No. So why was I holding myself to a different standard? I began to understand that staying out of obligation is not loyalty. It is fear disguised as morality. And fear, no matter how well dressed, is still fear. The days leading up to my decision felt unreal. Everything looked sharper, more fragile, as if I was seeing my surroundings for the last time, because in a way, I was. I noticed small details I had ignored for years. Cracks in walls. The way light fell through windows. The sound of my own footsteps. It felt like saying goodbye to a version of myself that had tried very hard, and failed very quietly. I didn't hate that version of me. I felt sorry for them. On the final night before I left, I sat alone and tried to feel certainty. It didn't come. What came instead was acceptance. The understanding that no path forward would be painless. That every choice cost something. And that staying would cost me myself. I packed lightly. Not because I wanted to be efficient, but because I didn't want to carry symbols of a life I no longer belonged to. Objects have memories. I wasn't ready to take them with me. Before I closed the door, I hesitated. Not out of doubt, but out of grief. You can mourn a life even when you choose to leave it. Especially then. I didn't leave a letter. I didn't make a speech. I didn't explain. I just stepped outside, and closed the door behind me. What I didn't understand yet was that leaving doesn't end the story. It only removes the noise. And in that silence, you are finally forced to face the one person you've been avoiding the longest. Yourself. The silence didn't heal me the way I thought it would. At first, it felt like relief. The kind that comes after holding a heavy weight for too long. No one knew where I was supposed to be. No one expected explanations. No one asked questions I couldn't answer. I had space, real space, and for the first time in years, my thoughts had room to breathe. But silence is honest. And honesty can be brutal. Without the familiar structure of my old life, I had nothing to hide behind. No routines to numb me. No expectations to distract me. Just time. And myself inside it. That's when the regret arrived, not as panic, not as drama, but as a slow, steady ache. I began replaying moments I had ignored for years. Opportunities one dismissed. Words I swallowed. People I kept at arm's length because it felt safer than needing them. I realized something uncomfortable: leaving didn't erase my past. It removed the excuses. For a while, I wondered if I had made a mistake. If I had confused escape for growth. If staying and suffering quietly would have been more honorable. Those thoughts came late at night, when the world was asleep and there was no one to perform strength for. But then I remembered the person I was becoming before I left. Smaller. Quieter. Invisible. And I knew that going back would not bring peace, it would only bring familiarity. Starting over wasn't heroic. It was awkward. Lonely. Unimpressive. I wasn't reinventing myself in any dramatic way. No sudden success. No grand transformation. Just small, deliberate choices that felt strange because they were mine. I learned how uncomfortable freedom can be when you're not used to it. There were days when I missed my old life, not because it was good, but because it was known. Humans crave the familiar, even when it hurts them. Especially when it hurts them in predictable ways. I had to learn who I was without apology. Without permission. Without an audience. That process was slower than I expected. Some days, I felt like I had gained 10 years of life. Other days, I felt like I had lost them. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a negotiation. Between who I had been, and who I was finally allowing myself to become. The hardest truth I faced was this: I hadn't only been abandoned by life. I had abandoned myself first. That realization didn't crush me. It clarified everything. Because if I had the power to disappear from my own life, I also had the power to return. Not to the past. Not to old versions. But to the present. I stopped waiting to feel ready. Readiness is a myth we use to delay courage. I started acting before certainty arrived. Speaking before my voice felt steady. Choosing before fear loosened its grip. Some people never understood my disappearance. Some never forgave it. I had to accept that too. You don't get to rewrite other people's stories when you change yours. And that's okay. Because the goal was never to be understood. It was to be real. Now, when I look back, I don't see a wasted life. I see a life paused for too long and then resumed, imperfectly, late, but honestly. If you're listening to this and feeling that quiet weight in your chest, the one that doesn't scream, but doesn't go away, hear this: you don't need to destroy your life to change it. But you do need to stop living it on autopilot. Staying silent is still a choice. Waiting is still a decision. And time will move on with or without your permission. I didn't leave because I hated my life. I left because I finally wanted to live it. And even now, every day, I have to choose that again. Because the most dangerous way to disappear is to stay, and never truly arrive.